Herod was hated by his people, but dreamed of an eternal legacy.
He rebuilt God's temple, not out of faith, but out of vanity.
He moved 500-ton stones that engineering still cannot explain.
He created land where there was none, raising the ancient world's largest platform. The sanctuary shone like a mountain of snow and gold under the sun.
But the prophecy was fulfilled. Fire consumed the glory. Only the wall remains.
The monument to a king's pride became the altar of millions.
What was meant for Herod, God turned into the holiest place on earth.
Write in the comments where you are watching from. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. We continue. He was despised by his own people. They called him half-Jew, a puppet of Rome, a bloodthirsty tyrant. Herod knew he would die unloved, so he decided to build something so grandiose, so impossible, that even his enemies would have to admire it for millennia. He summoned 10,000 workers, he trained 1,000 priests as masons, and he erected the greatest religious structure of the ancient world, with stones that modern engineering still struggles to explain. The year was 19 before Christ. Herod the Great had governed Judea under the mantle of Rome for almost 2 decades. His palaces already dotted the desert, his fortresses watched every road, but none of this conquered the heart of his people. The Jews saw him as an impostor, an Edomite, a descendant of Esau, not of Jacob. Herod's family had been forced to convert to Judaism only 3 generations prior. For the devotees of Jerusalem, that man would never be one of them. And Herod knew this. The historian Flavius Josephus recorded that Herod lived in constant paranoia. He had spies on every corner. Sometimes he disguised himself as a commoner and wandered the streets at night listening to what they spoke of him. He suspected everyone. He executed his own wife, Mariamne, the woman he swore to love above all, based on rumors of treason. He ordered the killing of his mother-in-law, his wife's grandfather, 3 of his own sons, a brother-in-law of 18 years, drowned during a feast by direct order of the king. The Emperor Caesar Augustus came to comment that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son. The joke was cruel but precise. Herod did not eat pork for observing some Jewish customs, but he did not hesitate to spill the blood of his own family. This was the man who decided to rebuild the temple of God. Not for devotion, not for faith, for legacy. Herod wanted his name to echo through the centuries. He wanted even those who hated him to be forced to recognize his greatness. And the only way to achieve this was to build something that no one else could build, something that defied the possible. The project began with a seemingly insoluble problem, the Temple of Zerubbabel, which existed since the return from the Babylonian exile, stood at the top of Mount Moriah, the same mount where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac, the same place where Solomon erected the first sanctuary, destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 before Christ. The space there was limited. The slopes fell abruptly to the valleys around. There was no way to expand, unless you created land where it did not exist. Herod's engineers proposed something audacious. They would build gigantic retaining walls around the mount. They would fill the space between the new and old walls with thousands of tons of earth and rubble, and thus artificially they would double the size of the sacred platform. The result would be an esplanade of 16 hectares, the equivalent of 20 football fields, floating over a structure of solid stone. The largest religious platform of the ancient world, but for this they needed stones. Enormous stones, impossible stones. The quarries lay 4 kilometers from the Temple Mount, in the region that today is known as the Russian Compound, in the heart of modern Jerusalem. The rock there was Meleke limestone, a geological formation of 200 million years, created when all that region was submerged under an ancient sea. This limestone had a special property. When extracted moist from the underground, it was relatively soft and easy to shape, but upon drying under the sun, it hardened like concrete. The masons cut blocks directly from the bedrock. First, they smoothed the upper surface of the stone. Then, they dug narrow channels of 10 to 15 centimeters around the block, on 3 sides. On the 4th side, at the base, they inserted wedges of dry wood. Then they soaked these wedges with water. The wood swelled. The pressure increased, and the stone broke loose from the mountain with a dull crack. The smaller stones weighed between 2 and 8 tons, sufficient to build the edifices upon the platform. But the retaining walls demanded something much larger. At the corners of the structure, where the pressures were most intense, Herod ordered blocks of 50 tons, 70 tons, some reached 100, and then there was the western stone. It is still there, buried in the western wall tunnels, accessible only through a subterranean passage excavated by archaeologists in the last decades. 13.5 meters in length, the size of an articulated bus, 3 meters and 30 in height, higher than a light post, and an estimated depth between 2 and 4 meters. The calculated weight varies between 250 and 570 tons. To put in perspective, a fully loaded Boeing 747 weighs about 400 tons. Someone, 2,000 years ago, moved that stone. There were no cranes. There were no engines. There was no electric nor hydraulic energy. Only ropes, wood, beasts of burden, and the strength of human arms. Josephus records that 1,000 oxen were employed in the work. The workers used wooden rollers under the stones, pushing and pulling with ropes tied to protrusions left purposely on the sides of the blocks. These protrusions, bosses of about 30 centimeters, were later chiseled and removed, leaving the smooth surface we see today. The geographical advantage helped. The quarries lay 38 meters above the Temple Mount. The journey of more than 1.5 kilometers was all downhill. Gravity worked in favor. But even so, controlling a stone of 500 tons descending a hill was an operation of millimetric precision. One error and the block would crush dozens of workers. Or worse, it would crack, rendering months of work useless. Deaths certainly happened. Josephus does not record numbers, but in any project of this magnitude, the human cost was inevitable. The blocks arrived at the construction site already almost finished. This was essential. According to the biblical account of the construction of the first temple by Solomon, no metal tool could be used in the sacred place. The noise of hammers and chisels would profane the sanctuary. Herod, despite his dubious personal devotion, respected this tradition. Each stone was cut, shaped, and smoothed in the quarries. On the Temple Mount, they only needed to be positioned. And what positioning? The engineers developed an ingenious system. They built the walls from the bottom up, but from the inside out. First, they placed a row of stones in the valley around the original platform. Then they filled the space between the new wall and the mount with compacted earth. This created a new working surface, at the same level as the top of the first row of stones. From there, they could position the second row. More filling. Third row. And so forth. Rising, course after course, until the entire extension of the mount was enveloped in solid stone. Wooden cranes moved by human treadwheels, men walking inside large wheels like hamsters, lifted the smaller blocks. For the larger ones, earthen ramps were built, allowing the oxen to drag the stones upward at gentle angles. Some of these stones were positioned more than 30 meters above the foundations, 12 stories high. Absolute silence in the sanctuary. This seems impossible. 10,000 workers, thousands of oxen, cranes creaking, ropes stretching, and yet no sound of metal against stone in the sacred precinct. The logistics were extraordinary. All the noisy work happened in the quarries kilometers away. On the Temple Mount, only the silent fitting of previously prepared blocks. And what a fit! Herod's stones do not use mortar. There is no cement between them. Nothing holds them other than their own weight and the precision with which they were cut. Modern archaeologists measured the spaces between the blocks. In many places, the gap is less than 3 millimeters, the thickness of 2 sheets of paper. You cannot insert a knife blade between these stones. They were shaped to fit like pieces of a 3-dimensional puzzle, each one supporting and being supported by the neighbors. Each row of stones recedes about 3 centimeters in relation to the row below. It is not a construction error, it is deliberate engineering. When you look up along a very high and perfectly vertical wall, your brain creates an optical illusion, the sensation that the wall is about to fall upon you. This slight recession in each layer eliminates this illusion. Herod's engineers understood not only structural physics, but also visual psychology. The Babylonian Talmud preserves a tradition regarding the construction. During the years of work, according to the rabbis, the rains only fell at night. In the morning the winds blew, the clouds dispersed, the sun shone, and the workers could continue. They interpreted this as a sign of divine approval. God was blessing the construction of his house, even through the hands of such a problematic king. The temple itself, the central building where the sacrifices were offered and where the Holy of Holies was located, was erected in only 18 months. 1,000 priests trained specially as masons worked on this part. They were the only ones authorized to enter the most sacred areas. They were not professional builders, but they learned the craft specifically for this task. The daily sacrifices were never interrupted. While one side of the sanctuary was demolished and rebuilt, the other continued functioning. The worship of God did not stop even for a day. The porticos and outer walls took 8 more years, but the finishing works continued for decades. When Jesus visited the temple at the beginning of his ministry, the religious leaders said that the construction had already lasted 46 years, and it was not yet finished. The complex was only officially concluded in the year 62 after Christ, 81 years after the start of the works, and almost 70 years after Herod's death. 6 years before being destroyed. The final result was dazzling. The historian Josephus, who saw the temple with his own eyes before its destruction, described it thus: "Covered in plates of solid gold, the building reflected the rays of the rising sun with a brilliance so intense that visitors needed to avert their gaze. From afar, it looked like a mountain covered in snow, the white marble of the walls contrasting with the blinding gold of the sanctuary. The outer walls rose to 48 meters in height at their highest point, in the southeast corner. 15 stories. The west wall was 485 meters long, almost half a kilometer. The entire platform was surrounded by covered colonnades, the porticos, where merchants sold animals for sacrifice and money changers exchanged foreign coins for local currency. In the southeast corner, the royal portico presented 162 columns of white marble, each one so thick that 3 men holding hands could not embrace it. The ceiling was of carved cedar. Josephus wrote that someone looking from the top of this portico to the valley below would feel such vertigo that his vision would darken. And in the center of everything, the sanctuary proper. A building of 100 cubits in height, width and depth, about 52 meters in each dimension. A perfect cube of white marble and gold. The entrance was covered by a curtain embroidered in blue, purple, scarlet, and white, representing the elements of the universe. Behind it, the holy place, with the altar of incense, the table of showbread and the 7-branched candelabrum. And further beyond, separated by another curtain, the Holy of Holies, empty. The Holy of Holies of Herod's temple did not contain the Ark of the Covenant. It had disappeared centuries before, during the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. There remained only a stone, the foundation stone, according to Jewish tradition, the point from which God created the world. Once a year, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest entered that dark and solitary space to make intercession for the people. Pilgrims came from the entire Mediterranean world, 3 times a year, at Passover, at Pentecost, and at the Feast of Tabernacles. Jerusalem overflowed. The normal population of 100 to 200,000 people multiplied. Josephus states that during one Passover, 2,700,000 lambs were sacrificed. Even if this number is exaggerated, the scale was colossal. And all this happened upon those impossible stones. The Romans, who dominated the region, recognized the magnitude of the construction. For them, familiar with the Colosseum and the great aqueducts, the Temple of Jerusalem still impressed. Some called it the 8th wonder of the world. Others simply admitted never having seen anything like it. Herod died in the year 4 before Christ. His last days were of agony, a disease that modern historians speculate to have been gangrene or kidney failure. Until the end, his paranoia did not abandon him. Knowing that no one would mourn his death, he ordered that the principal Jewish leaders be imprisoned in the Hippodrome of Jericho. As soon as he died, all were to be executed. In this way, there would be weeping in Israel when Herod departed, even if it were not for him. The order was ignored. The prisoners were released. But the temple remained. For 74 years after the death of its builder, that monumental structure dominated the landscape of Jerusalem. Jesus was presented there as a baby, according to the law of Moses. At 12 years old, he astonished the doctors with his wisdom in the courts of the temple. Years later, he drove out the money changers with a whip of cords. He taught in the colonnades. He healed paralytics by the pool of Bethesda, a few meters from there. When the disciples pointed to the enormous stones, marveling at the construction, Jesus responded with a somber prophecy. There shall not be left here stone upon stone that shall not be thrown down. In the year 66 after Christ, Judea rebelled against Rome. It was the climax of decades of tension, suffocating taxes, corrupt governors, insurrections crushed with brutality. The Zealots took Jerusalem. They expelled the Roman garrison. They declared independence. Rome would not tolerate such an affront. The Emperor Nero sent Vespasian with legions to crush the revolt. City after city fell. The survivors fled to Jerusalem, swelling the population of the besieged city. When Nero died and Vespasian was proclaimed emperor, his son Titus assumed command of the siege. In April of the year 70, Titus besieged Jerusalem during Passover. More than 100,000 people were trapped inside the walls, pilgrims who came for the feast and never left. The siege lasted 143 days. Famine devastated the city. Josephus records indescribable horrors, mothers cooking their own children to survive, corpses rotting in the streets, the stench reaching the Roman camp. In August, the Romans breached the defenses. The battle for the Temple Mount was fierce. The Jewish defenders, starving and exhausted, fought to the last man. Josephus states that Titus wanted to preserve the temple, an architectural jewel that would ornament the empire. But in the chaos of battle, a Roman soldier, hoisted upon the shoulders of another, cast a torch through a golden window. The fire took hold of the sanctuary. The gold melted. The silver ran down the gaps between the stones. When the flames finally died down, the Roman soldiers realized that there was solidified gold in the crevices. Then they began to dismantle the walls, stone by stone, to recover every gram of precious metal. The prophecy of Jesus was fulfilled literally. Not one stone was left upon another, except the retaining walls. The Romans had no interest in demolishing the platform. Those gigantic stones hid no gold, and removing them would require more effort than it was worth. So they stayed. The Roman general in charge of the destruction of the Western Wall, according to a tradition preserved in the Midrash, chose to leave it standing, as a testimony to future generations of the greatness of what Rome had destroyed. In the year 70, the Romans estimate that 600,000 people died in Jerusalem. Tens of thousands were enslaved. The golden menorah and the silver trumpets of the temple were taken to Rome, where they paraded in Titus's triumph. The Arch of Titus, which still exists in the Roman Forum, shows soldiers carrying these treasures. The Jews were banished from Jerusalem. The city was renamed Aelia Capitolina. A temple to Jupiter was erected over the ruins of the sanctuary. For centuries, Jews could only visit the site once a year, on the 9th day of the month of Av, the date of the destruction, to lament beside the remaining stones. Hence the name that external observers gave to the place, the Wailing Wall. But Herod's stones remained. 2,000 years passed. Empires were born and fell. Byzantines, Arabs, Crusaders, Mamluks, Ottomans, British, all governed Jerusalem. Earthquakes shook the region. Wars destroyed and rebuilt the city several times. The Dome of the Rock was erected over the Temple Mount in the 7th century, the Al-Aqsa Mosque as well. But Herod's walls did not move. 45 layers of stone compose the Western Wall today, 28 above ground, 17 below. The first 7 visible rows are original, placed more than 2,000 years ago by those 10,000 workers and 1,000 priests. The upper layers were added later, in the Umayyad and Mamluk periods. The difference is visible. The Herodian stones have characteristic beveled edges, frames of 5 to 20 centimeters, chiseled with precision on each block. The later additions are smaller, more irregular, clearly inferior. The total height of the wall from the bedrock to the top is 32 meters. The section visible in the prayer plaza is only 62 meters long, a tiny fraction of the original 488 meters. But it is sufficient. 12 million people visit the Western Wall every year. Jews, Christians, Muslims, people of all faiths and of no faith. They come from all continents. They touch the cold stones, they whisper prayers in dozens of languages, and they tuck little notes into the crevices between the blocks. More than 1 million notes per year. Prayers written on pieces of paper, napkins, notebook pages, even gum wrappers. Requests to God, thanksgivings, laments, hopes. Popes have already left notes there. American presidents, celebrities, soldiers before battles, mothers pleading for their children. Children with crooked handwriting asking for simple things. Twice a year, before Passover and before the Jewish New Year, officials remove the notes. They use only their hands or wooden sticks. Metal tools are not allowed, following the same tradition of 2 millennia ago. The papers are collected in bags and then buried in the cemetery of the Mount of Olives, with the same respect given to damaged Torah scrolls. Because according to Jewish tradition, any paper where the name of God is written cannot be destroyed. It must be buried. The prayers accumulate in the sacred earth. Millions of them, year after year, century after century, and the stones continue there. Silent witnesses. The man who placed them wanted to be remembered for his greatness. Herod built palaces. In Masada, in Jericho, in Caesarea. He erected impenetrable fortresses. He founded entire cities. But it is for the Wailing Wall that his name is still pronounced, not as he imagined. No one goes to the Western Wall to admire Herod's engineering. No one thinks of him while touching those ancient stones. People go there to find God, to weep, to celebrate, to ask, to thank. The stones that Herod cut for his own glory became the most sacred place of Judaism, the closest point Jews can get to the site where the temple once existed. Jesus walked through those courts. Paul was almost killed there, falsely accused of bringing Gentiles beyond the permitted barrier. The entire history of the New Testament happened in the shadow of those stones. The veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom when Christ died on the cross, the veil that hung in the sanctuary that Herod built, the mega-construction that cannot be explained. Because still today, with all our technology, engineers debate how those stones were moved. Computer simulations try to recreate the methods. Archaeologists propose theories, longer ramps, more complex lever systems, techniques not yet discovered. But no one has reproduced the feat. No one has cut, transported and positioned 500 tons of limestone with millimetric precision using only resources of the 1st century. Some questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is how it should be. Because the true mystery is not in the engineering, it is in the purpose Herod built for himself, for his glory, for his memory. But God had other plans for those stones. They would shelter the boy of Bethlehem, presented in the temple by Mary and Joseph. They would hear the teachings of the Master of Galilee. They would see the blind recover their sight, the paralytic walk, the leper be purified, and after everything was destroyed, they would remain, as a reminder, as a testimony, as a place where generations not yet born would come to pour out their tears and their hopes. The most hated man in Judea built the house that God would call his own. The engineering that defies explanation served a purpose that Herod never imagined. And the stones continue there, waiting, as they have always waited.